March 17, 1940, 6 a.m. Italian Naval Intelligence Headquarters, Rome. Admiral Giuseppe Romano stood before a wall map of the Mediterranean, compass in hand, calculating distances. 6 months. That's how long Italy could wage war before the fuel ran out. Benito Mussolini spoke of restoring the Roman Empire, of making the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. Romano's calculations told a different story. Italy possessed a modern navy of 6 battleships and 19 cruisers, impressive logistics on paper, but zero domestic oil production. The Admiral's memorandum to Il Duce outlined the mathematics of disaster. It was filed, unread. By September 1943, the Italian fleet would surrender to the Allies with full fuel tanks, having conserved resources for 3 years, waiting for a decisive battle that never came. This is the story of how strategic ambition collapsed because of one missing resource, and why the man who predicted it watched helplessly as an empire drowned in its own hubris. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Giuseppe Romano was born in 1898 in Livorno, a port city where he grew up watching ships enter and leave harbor. His father managed a coal depot. Romano learned early that navies ran on fuel, not glory. He joined the Regia Marina in 1916, served in the Great War, and rose through intelligence assignments that taught him one skill above all others: reading supply manifests and calculating consumption rates. By 1939, at age 41, Romano commanded the Naval Intelligence Logistics Analysis Section. His job was counting tons of fuel oil, ammunition expenditure rates, spare parts inventories, everything measured in numbers that didn't lie. Italy in 1940 was intoxicated with imperial ambition. Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia in 1936, sent troops to support Franco in Spain, and signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler's Germany. Italian propaganda proclaimed the resurrection of Roman glory. The Mediterranean would become Italian again, as it was 2,000 years ago when Roman galleys ruled every shore. The Regia Marina possessed modern warships, battleships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, displacing 45,000 tons each, armed with 9 15-inch guns. Cruisers like Pola and Zara, fast and heavily armed. Destroyers, submarines, auxiliary vessels. On paper, Italy commanded the 3rd largest navy in the world, after Britain and America. Romano understood what the maps and propaganda didn't show. Every single ship burned fuel oil, and Italy produced none. January 1940. Romano's office in Rome contained filing cabinets packed with consumption data from the past decade. He worked at night, calculating. The numbers were brutal. Italy imported 88% of its coal and 100% of its petroleum. Every drop of fuel oil came from foreign sources: Romania, Iraq, Mexico, Venezuela, the United States. The Regia Marina's 6 battleships consumed approximately 10,000 tons of fuel oil per month during active operations. The 19 cruisers needed another 15,000 tons. Destroyers, submarines, auxiliary vessels, merchant ships, 35,000 more tons. Total requirement for a navy at war: 60,000 tons of fuel oil per month. Italy's strategic reserve in January 1940, 360,000 tons. Simple division, 6 months. If the British cut off imports, which they would the moment war began, Italy could operate its fleet for 6 months before the tanks ran dry. After that, the proud Roman navy would sit in port, magnificent and useless. Romano drafted a 20-page memorandum. He used no inflammatory language, just mathematics, monthly consumption rates, import dependency percentages, reserve duration calculations, alternative scenarios. The conclusion was unavoidable. Italy could not sustain a Mediterranean war without guaranteed fuel supplies from the Axis partners, and Romania's Plosti oil fields were already stretched supplying Germany's mechanized divisions. He submitted the memorandum through official channels on February 23, 1940. It traveled up the command structure to Admiral Domenico Cavagnari, Chief of Staff of the Italian Navy. Cavagnari forwarded it to the Ministry of War. From there it reached Mussolini's desk. Il Duce never read it. Or if he read it, he didn't care. Mussolini believed in willpower and destiny, not logistics. The memorandum was filed in bureaucratic archives. Romano received no response. On March 18th, Hitler and Mussolini met at the Brenner Pass. Mussolini promised Italian entry into the war at the opportune moment. That moment came June 10, 1940, when France was collapsing. Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, believing the conflict would end in weeks. Romano knew differently. France might fall, but Britain controlled Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. The Mediterranean was about to become a British lake, and Italy's fuel supply was about to be strangled. June 10, 1940. Romano watched the fleet prepare for action. Littorio and Vittorio Veneto received full bunkers. The cruiser squadrons loaded ammunition and provisions. Submarine captains received patrol assignments. Everything looked ready. Romano calculated fuel consumption rates and marked a date on his calendar, December 10, 1940. 6 months. After that, choices would become stark: conserve fuel and avoid action, or fight aggressively and run dry. The first major operation came July 9th, the Battle of Punta Stilo off Calabria. The Regia Marina sortied with 2 battleships, 16 cruisers, and escorts to intercept British Force H. The engagement lasted 4 hours. Italian ships fired 2,374 rounds of ammunition. They damaged 1 British cruiser. In return, the British damaged battleship Giulio Cesare with a single 15-inch shell that struck the funnel, forcing withdrawal. Fuel consumption for the operation, 18,000 tons. 1 day's action consumed more than a quarter of 1 month's supply. Admiral Inigo Campioni, the fleet commander, reported the action as a tactical success. Romano filed his own report noting the fuel-to-result ratio. 18,000 tons expended, minimal damage inflicted, no strategic gain. The British remained in control of the central Mediterranean. The memorandum went into files, unread by those making decisions. October 28, 1940. Mussolini launched the invasion of Greece without consulting his military chiefs. The operation was supposed to be swift. Italian divisions would sweep through Epirus and reach Athens in 2 weeks. Romano calculated what the army planners had ignored. Mechanized divisions needed fuel: trucks, tanks, armored cars, all burning gasoline. The Albanian supply routes were primitive mountain roads inadequate for modern logistics. The Greek campaign consumed fuel at catastrophic rates, not for victories, but for retreats. By November, Greek counteroffensives were pushing Italian forces back into Albania. Trucks burned fuel evacuating wounded. Supply convoys burned fuel trying to reach forward positions. The Navy burned fuel ferrying reinforcements to Albanian ports. And every leader came from the strategic reserve, now approaching the critical threshold. November 11th to 12th, 1940. The British struck. Operation Judgment. 21 ferry Swordfish. Torpedo bombers from HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto harbor. In one night, the Regia Marina lost half its effective battleship strength. Conte di Cavour sank in shallow water, out of action for the war. Littorio and Caio Duilio crippled, requiring months of repairs. The attack demonstrated what Romano had argued in his February memorandum. A fleet tied to port for fuel conservation was vulnerable to attack. Better to be at sea and mobile, even if it meant exhausting reserves faster. Admiral Campioni protested the British cowardice of attacking at anchor. Romano noted in his logbook, "We were in port to conserve fuel. Enemy exploited our predictability. This is the consequence of resource scarcity." December 10, 1940. 6 months after the war began. Romano reviewed inventory reports. Fuel reserves, 187,000 tons remaining. Consumption rate, averaging 42,000 tons per month due to Greek campaign demands and naval operations. At current rate, 4.5 months remaining. The situation was worse than predicted because the Army's logistical chaos in Greece was draining reserves intended for the Navy. Romano prepared a second memorandum. He outlined 3 options. Option 1. Aggressive naval operations to support Greece campaign and challenge British control of Mediterranean. Duration: 90 days maximum before complete fuel exhaustion. Result: probable major fleet engagement, significant casualties, no guarantee of strategic success, 0 reserves remaining. Option 2. Moderate operations conserving fuel for critical moments. Duration: extend reserves to 10 months. Result: British maintain Mediterranean control, Italy reduced to defensive posture, strategic initiative lost. Option 3. Minimal operations, preserve fleet in being. Duration: extend reserves to 18 months. Result: Navy becomes irrelevant. British dominate Mediterranean unchallenged. Fleet survives but accomplishes nothing. The memorandum concluded, "Without secure external fuel supplies, Italy cannot wage Mediterranean war. The fleet is an expensive symbol, not an effective weapon." Recommend opening negotiations with Germany for guaranteed fuel allocations or withdrawing from active operations entirely. Admiral Arturo Riccardi, who had replaced Cavagnari as Chief of Staff in December 1940, read this memorandum. He summoned Romano to headquarters in Rome. "Admiral Romano, your analysis is mathematically correct and strategically defeatist. Il Duce will not accept that the Regia Marina cannot fulfill its role." Romano stood at attention. "Sir, Il Duce's acceptance does not change fuel consumption rates. The Germans will provide what we need. The Germans are preparing for Operation Barbarossa. Ploesti's production will prioritize Wehrmacht mechanized divisions. We are not their first concern." Riccardi's face reddened. "You will not submit such memoranda again. Morale must be maintained." Romano left the meeting understanding. Reality would not be acknowledged until it became undeniable. The fleet would continue operations, burning through reserves, until the moment came when ships couldn't leave port. Then someone would blame betrayal, conspiracy, anything except poor planning and resource scarcity. March 28, 1941, the Battle of Cape Matapan. The Regia Marina sortied with battleship Vittorio Veneto and 8 cruisers to intercept British convoys. Poor coordination, inadequate air cover, and British radar advantage resulted in disaster. Cruisers Pola, Zara, and Fiume sunk. Destroyers Alfieri and Carducci lost. Over 2,300 sailors killed. Vittorio Veneto damaged and forced to retreat. The battle consumed 22,000 tons of fuel. The result was the worst Italian naval defeat since Lissa in 1866. Romano noted in his records, aggressive operations with inadequate preparation produce maximum fuel consumption and maximum casualties. Predictable outcome of attempting strategic reach beyond resource capacity. After Matapan, Admiral Angelo Iachino, the new fleet commander, adopted a different policy. The battle fleet would sortie only when victory was certain. Fuel conservation became the unstated priority. Convoys to North Africa would be protected by destroyers and light forces, not battleships. The big ships, Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, Roma, would remain in port, maintained and ready, but inactive, preserving them for the decisive battle. Romano watched this policy take hold with grim satisfaction. It was option 3 from his December memorandum: preserve the fleet by making it irrelevant. The British dominated the Mediterranean. Italian convoys to North Africa took horrific losses, but the battleships survived, their fuel tanks carefully managed. April through December 1941. The war expanded catastrophically. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, drawing even more fuel from Ploesti. The United States entered the war. North Africa became a grinding attrition campaign where Rommel's Africa Corps fought with intermittent fuel supplies. Italian East Africa fell completely. Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somaliland, all lost by November. 100,000 Italian troops surrendered. The East African colonies were isolated because the Regia Marina couldn't spare fuel for relief operations. Romano compiled monthly statistics. June 1941, 34,000 tons consumed, mostly convoy escorts. July 1941, 28,000 tons, reduced sorties. August 1941, 31,000 tons, Malta convoy operations. September 1941, 26,000 tons, conservation policy taking effect. October 1941, 23,000 tons. November 1941, 25,000 tons. December 1941, 27,000 tons. The fleet was consuming an average of 28,000 tons per month, well below the 60,000-ton wartime requirement Romano had calculated in January 1940. They were accomplishing this by avoiding combat. British ultra-intelligence intercepts later revealed that Admiral Cunningham, commanding British Mediterranean forces, was puzzled by Italian inactivity. He expected aggressive sorties. Instead, Italian battleships remained in port. Cunningham didn't know about Romano's memoranda, but he understood the mathematics. He wrote in his memoirs, "The Italian Navy's greatest weakness was not courage or seamanship, but fuel. They couldn't afford to fight us even when they had local superiority." January through June 1942. The war in North Africa intensified. Rommel advanced toward Egypt. British forces besieged in Tobruk. Malta under siege, pounded by Axis air attacks. This was the moment for Italian naval dominance. With Malta neutralized and Egypt threatened, Italy could have secured the central Mediterranean. But every major operation required fuel the Regia Marina didn't have. June 1942. Operation Vigorous and Operation Harpoon. British convoys attempting to resupply Malta. The Italian fleet sortied with 2 battleships and numerous escorts. Fuel consumption, 41,000 tons. The convoys were turned back, but the British submarines and aircraft damaged Italian ships. Admiral Iachino reported a tactical success. Romano noted, "We burned 6 weeks of fuel reserves to delay British resupply by 2 weeks. The mathematics of attrition favor the enemy." August 1942. Operation Pedestal. The British attempted another Malta convoy with massive escort, 3 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, 32 destroyers protecting 14 merchant ships. The Italian fleet didn't sortie. Fuel reserves had dropped below the critical threshold where risking battleships was unconscionable. Instead, submarines and aircraft attacked. 9 merchant ships were sunk, but 5 got through, including the tanker Ohio carrying 10,000 tons of fuel. Malta survived. The British maintained their Mediterranean base, and the Italian battle fleet sat in La Spezia and Taranto, beautiful and impotent. Romano analyzed the pedestal operation mathematically. The Italians had expended negligible fuel by not sorting the battle fleet, but they had conceded Mediterranean control. Malta remained operational. British submarines and aircraft continued sinking Italian supply convoys to North Africa. Rommel's advance stalled at El Alamein, partly because fuel couldn't reach him reliably. The decision to conserve fuel meant losing the strategic campaign. November 1942. Operation Torch. Americans landed in French North Africa. Now Italy faced enemies on 3 sides: British advancing from Egypt, Americans in Algeria and Morocco, and Malta-based forces interdicting the central Mediterranean. The situation was catastrophic. The Italian Navy had preserved its battle fleet beautifully. Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, Roma, all maintained in perfect condition, full ammunition stocks, trained crews. Fuel reserves by November 1942, approximately 280,000 tons, carefully conserved over 2.5 years. Admiral Riccardi summoned Romano to a strategy conference. 20 officers sat around a table studying maps. Riccardi asked for Romano's logistics assessment. Romano presented data tables. We have sufficient fuel for 4 months of intensive operations or 12 months of conservation. Germany cannot provide additional supplies. Ploesti is operating at maximum capacity for Wehrmacht needs. Romania is under Soviet pressure. The strategic situation will deteriorate before it improves. I recommend— Riccardi interrupted. What do you recommend, Admiral? Sortie the entire battle fleet in one decisive operation. Inflict maximum damage on enemy forces, accept losses. Demonstrate that the Regia Marina fought. The room went silent. An admiral whose career was built on conservation was recommending spending everything. Riccardi said slowly, "That is suicide." "No, sir. Continuing as we are is suicide. We die slowly, burning fuel for convoy escorts while British and Americans grow stronger. At least a major fleet action serves a purpose. We lose the ships fighting, not rusting in port." Il Duce would never approve such a proposal. Il Duce did not approve my 1940 memorandum warning we lacked fuel to wage war. Reality does not require his approval to exist. Romano left that conference knowing no decisive action would occur. The fleet would be preserved until the end, and the end was approaching faster than anyone in that room wanted to acknowledge. July 10, 1943. The Allies invaded Sicily, the largest amphibious operation in history to that point. 160,000 troops, 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 3,000 ships, massive air support. The Italian defense collapsed within days. The Regia Marina attempted to disrupt the invasion fleet. Cruisers made sorties, destroyers attacked, submarines deployed. The battle fleet remained in port. Fuel reserves, enough for one major sortie, carefully preserved for the decisive moment. That moment never came. Sicily fell in 38 days. Mussolini was deposed July 25th, arrested by the king's order. Marshal Pietro Badoglio formed a new government and began secret negotiations with the Allies. The war was ending. September 8, 1943. Italy surrendered unconditionally. The armistice was announced publicly. Admiral Giuseppe received orders. Sail the fleet to Allied-controlled ports in Malta and North Africa. Surrender the ships intact. The Italian battle fleet prepared to sortie, not for combat, for capitulation. Battleships Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and Italia, formerly Roma, formed the core. Cruisers, Duca d'Aosta, Garibaldi, Duca degli Abruzzi, 8 destroyers as escorts. Fuel reserves were more than adequate. The ships that had been conserved for 3 years to avoid combat now had fuel to surrender. September 9th. The fleet departed La Spezia. German forces in Italy, furious at Italian betrayal, attempted to stop them. Luftwaffe bombers attacked the formation off Sardinia. At 3:52 p.m., a Fritz X guided bomb struck battleship Roma. The 2,000-pound warhead penetrated the deck and detonated in the forward magazine. Roma exploded and sank in minutes. Admiral Carlo Bergamini and 1,393 sailors died. Italia was also hit, but survived. The fleet continued to Malta. Giuseppe Romano was not aboard the surrendering ships. He had been transferred to a logistics posting in Taranto. He watched from shore as the surviving fleet sailed away. 3 years of careful fuel conservation, of avoiding battle, of preserving ships for the decisive moment. And the decisive moment was sailing to an Allied port to surrender. After the armistice, Romano was interviewed by Allied naval intelligence officers. They wanted to understand Italian naval strategy. Why had such an impressive fleet accomplished so little? Romano provided his 1940 memorandum and subsequent reports. The British and American officers read them with professional interest. A Royal Navy commander asked, "Admiral, why did you continue in your position when your advice was ignored?" Romano answered, "Because professional duty required me to provide accurate data even when decisions were made by political fantasy. Numbers don't lie. Logistics determine strategy. We had no oil. Therefore, we could not win a Mediterranean war." But admitting that truth conflicted with fascist propaganda about Italian greatness. So we built beautiful ships and watched them rust in port while pretending we were preserving them for victory. Do you believe Italy could have won with adequate fuel supplies? No. Britain controlled Gibraltar and Suez. They had global resources and American industrial support. We had regional strength and no strategic depth. Fuel was the most obvious deficiency, but not the only one. Even with unlimited fuel, Italian coordination with Germany was poor, our intelligence inadequate, our leadership compromised by political interference. But fuel was the difference between losing slowly and losing immediately. We chose to lose slowly. Post-war analysis by military historians confirmed Romano's calculations with precision. Italian fuel consumption during World War II. Total strategic reserve, June 1940, 360,000 tons. Total consumption, June 1940 to September 1943. Approximately 1.1 million tons. German fuel allocations to Italy, 740,000 tons. Fuel at surrender, 280,000 tons, unused. The Regia Marina had operated for 39 months on imported fuel, carefully rationing consumption to extend the fleet's lifespan. But rationing consumption meant avoiding combat, and avoiding combat meant strategic irrelevance. British Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who fought against the Italians throughout the Mediterranean campaign, wrote in his memoirs, "The Italian Navy was a magnificent fleet that never quite seemed to believe in its own capability. They had fine ships and brave sailors, but lacked the aggressive spirit necessary for sea control. Later, I learned about their fuel situation and understood. They couldn't afford to be aggressive. Every sortie was weighed against dwindling reserves. That's a paralyzing constraint for any commander." The German perspective was different. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, blamed Italian timidity for Axis failures in the Mediterranean. In post-war interrogations, he claimed the Italian fleet could have defeated British forces if used aggressively. When informed about Italy's fuel situation, Raeder responded, "That should have been addressed before entering the war. Strategic resources determine whether nations can fight. Italy chose to fight without the capacity to sustain operations. That is political stupidity, not military failure." Romano's 1940 memorandum, filed and forgotten during the war, became a case study in military logistics courses after 1945. The United States Naval War College used it as an example of strategic planning ignored for political reasons. The lesson: clear-eyed analysis of resource constraints must drive strategy, not the reverse. Mussolini had decided Italy would dominate the Mediterranean, then tried to find resources to support that decision. The proper sequence is assessing resources first, then defining achievable objectives. Giuseppe Romano retired from the Italian Navy in 1946 with the rank of Rear Admiral. He returned to Livorno, where he had grown up watching ships. He took no government position, wrote no memoirs, gave no interviews beyond the initial Allied intelligence debriefings. He managed a small shipping logistics company, calculating cargo weights and fuel consumption for merchant vessels. The work was identical to his wartime duties, but without the frustration of decisions made for political theater rather than practical possibility. Romano died in 1972 at age 74. His obituary in the Livorno newspaper mentioned his naval service briefly, noting participation in Mediterranean operations. No mention was made of his 1940 memorandum. The mathematics of disaster he had calculated with precision were forgotten by everyone except military historians studying logistics failures. In 1995, the Italian Naval History Institute published Romano's collected reports and memoranda. The introduction noted, Admiral Romano understood in 1940 what Italian leadership refused to acknowledge until 1943. Nations cannot wage wars beyond their resource capacity. Strategic ambition unsupported by logistical reality produces only casualties and defeat. Romano's memoranda were ignored during the war, but vindicated by history. He was a prophet of strategic realism in an era of political fantasy. The Mediterranean today shows no trace of Mussolini's Mare Nostrum empire. The Italian Navy operates modern ships in NATO exercises. The strategic lesson Romano tried to teach in 1940 is now standard doctrine. Assess resources, define achievable objectives, align strategy with capacity. It sounds obvious. But Mussolini's Italy, like many nations before and since, believed willpower and destiny could overcome arithmetic. They were wrong. Giuseppe Romano knew it in March 1940, standing before that wall map with a compass, calculating distances and fuel consumption rates. 6 months. That's how long Italy could fight. Everything afterward was conservation, delay, and eventual surrender. The ships survived. The sailors died. The empire dissolved. And the one resource Italy needed, the fuel that powers modern navies, was never secured because acknowledging its absence meant admitting the war was unwinnable from the start. Some truths are too expensive to acknowledge, so they are filed away, unread, until defeat makes them impossible to ignore.